They told him the job was simple. Watch the kids. Keep your head down. Never ask about the father's business. The pay was life-changing. The NDA was thicker than a phone book. But Elias didn't know that signing that paper was signing away his safety. He thought he was working for a businessman. He didn't know he was walking into the den of Dante Calvetti, the most dangerous alpha in Chicago. And he certainly didn't know that in 3 months, he'd be bleeding out on a marble floor, taking a bullet meant for children that weren't even his. This is the story of how an innocent Omega nanny brought a Mafia king to his knees. The interview didn't take place in an office. It took place in the back of a blacked-out Cadillac Escalade, circling the loop in downtown Chicago. Elias Mitchell sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, trying to stop them from trembling. His scent, honey and chamomile, soft and unassuming, was barely detectable beneath the suppressant patches he wore on his inner wrist. He'd learned years ago that being an Omega in this city meant keeping yourself small, keeping yourself hidden. Across from him sat a man who wasn't the employer, but the lawyer. Mr. Sterling. He looked like a shark in a three-piece suit, his eyes scanning Elias's resume with a mixture of boredom and scrutiny. Clean record, Sterling muttered, not looking up. No living relatives within the state. A degree in early childhood education from Northwestern, but you dropped out of your master's program. Why? Financial reasons, Elias said, his voice steady despite the nerves. My mother's medical bills. I needed to work immediately. Sterling finally looked up. The salary we are offering is $10,000 a month. Cash. Plus room and board at the estate. You will have zero expenses. Elias's breath hitched. 10,000. That could clear his debt in a year. It could pay for a specialist for his mother's condition. What's the catch? The catch, Sterling said, sliding a thick document across the leather seat, is privacy. Total, absolute silence. You do not have social media. You do not invite guests. You do not leave the property without an escort. And you never, under any circumstances, speak to the press or the police about Mr. Calvetti or his associates. If you breach this contract, you won't just be sued, Mr. Mitchell. You will be erased. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a weather forecast. Elias looked at the document. The Calvetti estate. He had heard the name Calvetti before, whispered on the news, in connection with sanitation unions and construction contracts. But usually accompanied by mugshots of men who looked much rougher than Mr. Sterling. I have 2 charges, Sterling continued. Toby and Bella. 5-year-old twins. They have gone through 4 nannies in 6 months. They are difficult. Their mother passed away 2 years ago. Their father is a busy alpha who requires peace. Elias thought of the eviction notice sitting on his kitchen counter. He thought of the empty fridge. He picked up the heavy fountain pen. Where do I sign? The Calvetti estate was a fortress. Located in Barrington Hills, it was surrounded by 12-foot iron fences and dense forest. When the gate opened, Elias saw men patrolling the grounds. They wore suits, but the bulges under their jackets were unmistakable. Security. Heavy security. He was shown to his room, a suite larger than his entire apartment, by the housekeeper, a stern beta woman named Mrs. Higgins who looked at Elias with something that might have been pity. Keep to the east wing, Mrs. Higgins instructed. The west wing is Mr. Calvetti's office and private quarters. He works late. He does not like noise. And he does not like strangers. When will I meet him? Elias asked, unpacking his meager belongings. If you're lucky, Mrs. Higgins said darkly, never. Elias met the twins an hour later in the playroom. It was a chaotic mess of expensive toys, smashed Lego sets, and overturned furniture. Toby was sitting on top of a bookshelf screaming, while Bella was systematically using a pair of scissors to cut the heads off a row of limited edition Barbie dolls. "Get out!" Toby screamed when he saw Elias. "Daddy said no more nannies. We want Daddy." "Daddy is working," Elias said softly, stepping over a decapitated doll. He didn't scold them. He didn't raise his voice. He saw the rage in their eyes, but beneath it, he saw the terrified abandonment. "And I'm not here to be a nanny. I'm here because I heard someone in this room knows how to build a Lego Death Star, and I've never been able to figure it out." Toby stopped screaming. He looked at the Lego box in Elias's hands. It took 3 hours. But by dinner time, the room was clean, the Death Star was half-built, and for the first time in months, the house was quiet. That night, unable to sleep, Elias went down to the kitchen for a glass of water. It was 2 a.m. The house was silent as a tomb. As he turned the corner toward the kitchen, he froze. The back door was open. A group of men were walking in, supporting a figure in the center. The smell of copper, sharp and metallic, hit his nose instantly. "Blood! Get the doctor!" A low, gravelly voice commanded. The voice was like thunder wrapped in velvet. Elias gasped, stepping back into the shadows. But his slipper squeaked against the marble. Every head turned. 4 guns were instantly drawn, pointed directly at his chest. The man in the center pushed his men aside. He was tall, well over 6'3", with hair black as pitch and eyes that burned with a cold, terrifying blue fire. He was wearing a white dress shirt that was soaked entirely red on the left side. This was Dante Calvetti. And he had just been shot. The Alpha's scent hit Elias like a physical blow, smoke and cedar and something darker, something that made Elias's hindbrain scream danger. Even injured, even bleeding, the man radiated power. His presence filled the entire corridor, pressing against Elias's senses like a weight. "Don't shoot," Dante growled, though his hand was pressed tight against his bleeding side. "It's the boy. The new hire." The men lowered their weapons, but they didn't holster them. A man with a scar running through his eyebrow, Adrian, Elias would learn later, stepped forward. Elias saw the blood. He saw the storm in Dante's eyes. Dante limped forward, the pain evident in the tight set of his jaw. He loomed over Elias, who was pressed against the wall, his heart hammering so hard he thought it would crack his ribs. The Alpha smelled of expensive cologne, gunpowder, and iron. And beneath it all, Elias caught a hint of something else, something that made his Omega instinct stir despite the terror. Hurt. The Alpha is hurt. "Elias," Dante said. It wasn't a question. I just wanted water," Elias whispered. Dante leaned in, his face inches from Elias's. He was devastatingly handsome in a brutal, jagged way, but his eyes were empty of mercy. The proximity was overwhelming. Elias could feel the heat radiating from the Alpha's body, could smell the blood soaking through his shirt. His own scent, honey and chamomile, spiked with fear, and he saw Dante's nostrils flare slightly. "The Alpha can smell me." "Of course he can." "You didn't see anything tonight," Dante said, his voice low and deadly. "You didn't see blood. You didn't see guns. You saw me coming home from a late business dinner where I spilled wine on my shirt. Do you understand?" "Yes," Elias managed to squeak. "Good. Because if you speak of this, the contract you signed will be the least of your problems." He turned to Adrian. "Get him out of here. And get the doctor." For the next 2 weeks, Elias lived on a knife's edge. He realized quickly that Dante Calvetti wasn't just a businessman. He was the Don of the Chicago outfit. The men guarding the house weren't security, they were soldiers. Elias tried to focus on the children. Toby and Bella were starving for affection. Dante was a ghost to them, a terrifying figure who appeared only to give orders or check security protocols. But Elias noticed things. He noticed that Dante always looked tired. He noticed that the alpha's scent, when he was near the children, softened slightly, the smoke and cedar giving way to something warmer. He noticed that Dante never touched his children, never hugged them, never seemed to know what to do with his hands when they were in the room. And he noticed that Dante's eyes followed him sometimes. Watching. Assessing. One Tuesday afternoon, Elias was in the garden with the twins. They were playing hide and seek in the hedge maze. It was a rare moment of sunshine and laughter. Suddenly, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the main gate. The guards at the perimeter tensed, rifles raised. Elias's instinct kicked in. He didn't wait to see who it was. "Game over," he shouted, his voice changing from playful to commanding. "Toby, Bella. Inside now. Run." The kids, sensing his fear, sprinted toward the back door. Elias ran behind them, his arms spread wide, as if he could shield them with his slender frame. He ushered them into the mudroom and locked the door, just as Dante stormed out of his office, a pistol in his hand. He looked out the window, saw the SUV turn around and speed off, and then turned his fury on Elias. "Who told you to bring them inside?" he roared. "I saw a car," Elias said, breathless, checking the kids for injuries. "It was moving too fast. It didn't look right." Dante stared at him. He lowered the gun. The SUV had been a probe. A rival family testing the response time of his guards. Most civilians would have frozen or stared. Elias had identified a threat and secured the targets, his children, in under 10 seconds. "You have good instincts," Dante said, his voice losing its edge. "I grew up in a bad neighborhood, Mr. Calvetti," Elias said, smoothing Bella's hair. "I know what a drive-by looks like before it happens." For the first time, Dante looked at him not as a liability, but as a person. He looked at how Bella was clinging to Elias's leg, burying her face in his jeans. Bella never touched anyone. "Dinner," Dante said abruptly. "Tonight. You'll eat with us. The children need to see their father." Apparently. Dinner was an awkward affair. The dining table was long enough to seat 20, but only 4 of them sat at one end. Dante ate in silence, his phone buzzing constantly next to his plate. Elias kept his eyes down, focusing on cutting Bella's steak into small pieces. "Daddy," Toby said, holding up a drawing. "Elias helped me draw a tiger." Dante glanced at the paper. "It's good. Eat your vegetables." "It's a Siberian tiger," Toby pressed, desperate for attention. "Elias says they are the strongest." "Elias knows a lot about tigers?" Dante asked, his eyes flicking to the omega. "I read a lot," Elias said, keeping his voice neutral. The alpha's gaze was intense, and Elias felt a flush creeping up his neck. He focused on his plate, trying to ignore the way his omega instincts were responding to the proximity of such a powerful alpha. "Mr. Calvetti," Elias said carefully, "Toby has a recital at his school on Friday. He's playing the triangle. It's a small part, but he's practiced for weeks." Dante sighed, rubbing his temples. "I have meetings on Friday. Adrian will take them." "He doesn't want Adrian," Elias said, his voice dropping, risking everything. "He wants you." The air in the room froze. The guard standing by the door shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke to Dante Calvetti like that. Dante slowly put down his fork. He looked at Elias. Do you know who I am, Mr. Mitchell? You know what I do to keep this food on this table? I know you are a father, Elias shot back, his hands shaking under the table, but his eyes locked on Dante's. And right now, that is the only job title that matters in this room. Dante stared at him for a long, agonizing minute. The twins held their breath. Friday, Dante said, picking up his wine glass. 2 p.m. Put it on my calendar. Toby's face lit up like a Christmas tree. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Later that night, Adrian cornered Elias in the hallway. Adrian was Dante's second-in-command. He was charming, handsome in a slick way. A beta, Elias guessed, though there was something predatory in his smile that didn't quite fit. His scent was sharp and chemical, like expensive cologne that covered something unpleasant beneath. You're playing a dangerous game, Angel, Adrian whispered, blocking Elias's path. Dom isn't a puppy you can train. You push him too far, he bites. I'm just doing my job, Adrian, Elias said, trying to step around him. Are you? Adrian smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Because it looks like you're playing house. Just remember, empires fall from the inside. Don't get too comfortable. Elias didn't know it then, but Adrian wasn't warning him. He was threatening him. Because Adrian had just made a deal with the Volkov family, the Russians who wanted Dante's territory. And the only thing standing in the way of Adrian's coup was Dante's focus. If Dante became a family man, Adrian couldn't manipulate him. Elias was becoming a problem. And in Adrian's world, problems were eliminated. Friday arrived with a sky the color of bruised iron. A storm was brewing over Lake Michigan, but the atmosphere inside the Calvetti estate was even heavier. Dante Calvetti adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. He was used to wearing $5,000 suits, but today the silk felt like a noose. He wasn't going to a sit-down with the cartel or a negotiation with the union bosses. He was going to a kindergarten recital. You look nice. Elias's voice floated down the stairs. Dante turned, and his breath hitched in his throat just for a second. Elias wasn't wearing his usual jeans and oversized sweater. He was wearing a simple navy blue button-up and tailored slacks that hugged his waist. His hair was pulled back, revealing the soft curve of his neck. He looked elegant. He belonged there. It's for the school, Elias said quickly, mistaking his stare for disapproval. They have a dress code for guests. It's fine, Dante grunted, turning away to hide the flicker of something dangerous waking up in his chest. Let's get this over with. The drive to the private school in Lincoln Park was executed with military precision. 3 SUVs, Dante and the family in the middle vehicle, bulletproof glass tinted so dark it was midnight inside. Toby was vibrating with anxiety, clutching his triangle. Bella was holding Elias's hand so tight her knuckles were white. What if I mess up? Toby whispered. Dante looked at his son. He didn't know what to say. In his world, if you messed up, you died. That wasn't exactly encouraging advice for a 5-year-old. Elias squeezed Toby's shoulder. You won't. But even if you miss a beat, just keep playing. No one knows the music but you. Make it your own. Dante looked at Elias. Make it your own. It was simple advice, but it worked. Toby nodded, his shoulders relaxing. The recital was an hour of screeching violins and off-key singing. To any other parent, it was adorable. To Dante, it was torture. Until Toby walked on stage. The boy looked terrified. He scanned the audience, his eyes wide. When he locked eyes with Dante in the third row, he froze. Dante sat up straighter. He didn't smile, he didn't know how to smile on command, but he nodded. A sharp, firm nod. I see you. I am here. Toby beamed. He hit the triangle with perfect timing. Ding! For a moment, just a moment, Dante Calvetti wasn't the Mafia king of Chicago. He was just a dad watching his kid. And he realized with a sudden pang of guilt that he owed this feeling to the Omega sitting next to him. He glanced at Elias. Elias was beaming, tears shining in his eyes as he applauded. He loved these kids. It wasn't just a paycheck. It was real. As the curtain fell, Dante leaned close to Elias's ear. Thank you, he murmured, his voice low and vibrating against Elias's skin. Elias turned, startled by the proximity. Their faces were inches apart. The electric tension between them was sudden and undeniable. Elias's scent, honey and chamomile, spiked, and Dante caught it. Beneath the suppressant patches, beneath the careful control, the Omega's true scent was blooming. Sweet. Warm. Mine. Before Elias could answer, Adrian appeared at the end of the aisle. He wasn't clapping. He was holding his earpiece, his face pale. He signaled to Dante. We have a problem. Dante's demeanor shifted instantly. The father vanished. The dawn returned. The warmth left his eyes, replaced by glacial ice. We're leaving, Dante whispered to Elias. Now. Get the kids. Don't run, but walk fast. What is it? Elias asked, sensing the shift. We've been compromised. The parking lot was chaos. Parents were milling about, hugging their children, taking photos. It was the worst possible environment for a security extraction. Too many civilians. Too many blind spots. Into the car. Now, Dante ordered, opening the rear door of the middle SUV. Elias ushered Toby and Bella inside. Get in. Buckle up. Heads down, he instructed calmly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. Dante was scanning the perimeter. He saw a gray van parked 2 rows over. The windows were down. A glint of metal flashed in the afternoon sun. Get down! Dante roared. The air shattered. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. Automatic gunfire erupted across the parking lot. Glass exploded. Parents screamed. The windshield of the lead SUV shattered. Ambush! Adrian screamed, returning fire from behind a parked sedan. Dante didn't dive for cover. He drew his weapon, a custom .45, and stood his ground, firing methodically at the van. He was a statue of violence, drawing the fire away from his children. But there were 2 teams. While Dante engaged the van, a motorcycle roared out from between 2 school buses behind them. The rider leveled a submachine gun directly at the open rear door of the SUV, where the children were screaming. Elias saw him. Dante was too far away. The guards were pinned down. Time seemed to slow down into a thick, honey-like sludge. Elias looked at Toby and Bella, huddled together on the leather seat. He looked at the black barrel of the gun. He looked at Dante, who was turning too slowly, horror dawning on his face. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the contract or the salary. He just moved. Elias threw himself across the back seat, covering both children with his body, shielding them like a human blanket. Bang! 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 3 shots rang out, louder than the rest. Elias felt a sledgehammer hit his back. The force slammed him against the leather seat. The pain wasn't immediate, it was just a sudden, cold shock, followed by a burning fire that spread through his chest. Elias! Toby screamed. Dante turned just in time to see the motorcycle speed off. He saw Elias slumped over his children. He saw the crimson stain rapidly expanding across the back of his navy blue button-up. A roar ripped from Dante's throat, a sound so primal and terrifying that even his own men flinched. He sprinted to the car, ripping the door open. "Daddy, he's not waking up." Bella was sobbing, her hands covered in red. Dante pulled Elias out of the car, laying him gently on the asphalt. His face was pale, his lips turning blue. He looked up at Dante, his eyes losing focus. The kids," he wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. "They're safe," Dante choked out, pressing his hands against the wound in Elias's shoulder and back to staunch the flow. "You saved them, Elias. You saved them." "Good," Elias whispered. His eyes rolled back. His head lolled to the side. "Stay with me," Dante shouted, shaking him. "Adrian, get the car. Forget the convoy. We're going to the hospital now." He scooped Elias up in his arms. The Omega felt impossibly light. For a man who had dealt death his entire life, the weight of Elias's life in his hands felt unbearable. As the SUV peeled out of the lot, tires screeching, Dante Calvetti looked down at the Omega bleeding out on his lap. He realized with a terrified clarity that if Elias died, the last part of his soul would die with him. The private clinic was hidden in an old warehouse district near the docks. It was off the grid, staffed by surgeons who had lost their licenses or were paid enough not to ask where the bullet holes came from. Dante paced the sterile white hallway like a caged tiger. He was still wearing his suit, now ruined, the white shirt stained rust red with Elias's blood. He hadn't washed his hands. He wanted to feel the reminder. Adrian stood by the door, looking nervous. "Dom, you need to change. The men are arriving. You can't let them see you like this." "I don't care what they see," Dante snarled. He stopped pacing and got right in Adrian's face. How did they know? The recital wasn't on the public calendar. Only 3 people knew the schedule. Me, you, and Elias. Adrian swallowed hard. "Dom, look, he's the new guy. We don't know his background, really. Maybe he tipped them off. A martyrdom play to get your trust." Dante grabbed Adrian by the throat and slammed him against the wall. The guards looked away. "He took a bullet for my children," Dante hissed, his voice low and lethal. "If he wanted them dead, he just had to step aside. If you ever insinuate he is a traitor again, I will cut out your tongue." He dropped Adrian. Adrian gasped for air, massaging his throat. "I'm just saying we need to investigate everyone." "It was the Volkovs," Dante said, staring at the operating room doors. "The motorcycle had their insignia. I know it was the Volkovs. And I will rain hellfire on them. But right now, I need him to live." The door swung open. An elderly doctor in green scrubs stepped out, pulling off his mask. Dante was on him in a second. "Well?" "He's stable," the doctor said, wiping sweat from his brow. "The bullet missed his spine by 2 millimeters. Punctured his lung and broke his scapula. He's lost a lot of blood, but he's young and strong. He'll make it." Dante let out a breath that felt like it had been held for 10 years. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. "Can I see him?" "He's sedated, but yes." Dante entered the room quietly. The beep of the heart monitor was the only sound. Elias lay in the center of the bed, looking small and fragile against the white sheets. And 4-line ran into his arm. His shoulder was heavily bandaged. Dante pulled a chair up to the bedside and sat down. He took Elias's hand, the hand that had built Lego sets, brushed Bella's hair, and held his gaze at the dinner table. It was cold. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the unconscious Omega. "I promised you safety. I failed." He brought Elias's hand to his lips and kissed his knuckles. The Omega's scent was faint beneath the antiseptic and blood, just a whisper of honey and chamomile. Even now, even like this, it called to something deep in Dante's chest. Something primal. Something that growled mine. "Daddy?" Dante turned. Toby and Bella were standing in the doorway, holding Mrs. Higgins's hands. They looked traumatized, their eyes red from crying. "Is Elias dead?" Bella asked, her voice trembling. "No, Piccolo," Dante said, waving them over. "Elias is sleeping. He's going to be okay." The twins rushed to the bed. They didn't climb on it, they just stood there, staring at Elias with reverence. "He jumped on us," Toby said softly. "The bad man had a gun, and he jumped on us." "I know," Dante said. He looked at his children, then at Elias. He realized then that the contract was void. Elias wasn't an employee. He wasn't a nanny. "He's an angel," Bella whispered, touching Elias's cheek. "Mommy sent him." The words hit Dante like a physical blow. His late wife. He had been so angry since she died. So shut off. He thought he could never let another Omega into this dangerous, violent life. But Elias was already in it. He had bled for it. He stood up, his resolve hardening into diamond. He gently guided the children out of the room, handing them back to Mrs. Higgins. "Take them home. Lock the estate down. No one in, no one out." "Where are you going, sir?" Mrs. Higgins asked. Dante walked back to the room, looked at Elias one last time, and then turned toward the exit. His eyes were no longer blue fire. They were black voids of vengeance. "I'm going to kill everyone who had a part in this," Dante said calmly. "And then I'm going to find the rat in my organization who sold us out." As he walked down the hallway, Adrian watched him go. Adrian's hand went into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his burner phone. He needed to make a call. The hit had failed. Dante was alive. The Omega was alive. And the devil was coming for them all. Chicago burned that night. Not literally. But the underworld felt the heat. Dante Calvetti did not go home to change. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He went to the Volkov Grand Operations Center, a shipping yard on the south side. He didn't take an army. He took 4 of his best men, including a terrifying enforcer named Luca who never spoke. They kicked down the doors of the main office. The Russians were counting money, stacks of cash wrapped in rubber bands. They scrambled for their weapons, but they were too slow. Dante moved through the room like a grim reaper. 2 shots. 2 bodies. He didn't seek cover. He walked forward with the terrifying inevitability of a natural disaster. His scent was overwhelming, smoke and cedar and rage, filling the room, pressing down on everyone present. The Alpha was in full dominance mode, and even the most hardened soldiers felt their instincts scream submit. He cornered the Volkov underboss, a man named Yuri, in the back office. Yuri was frantically trying to climb out a window. Dante grabbed him by the belt and threw him across the room. Yuri crashed into a glass display case, shattering it. "Who gave you the schedule?" Dante asked. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, which made it infinitely scarier. "I don't know." Yuri screamed, blood pouring from his nose. "We just got a text. An anonymous tip. Said the Calvetti boy would be at the school. Dante pressed the barrel of his gun to Yuri's knee. I don't believe in anonymity. Bang! Yuri shrieked. The phone. Check the phone. He pointed to a burner on the desk. Dante picked it up. He scrolled through the messages. Target at Lincoln Park. 2 p.m. Minimal security. The Omega is the weak link. Take them all out. Dante stared at the screen. The number was blocked, but the syntax, the Omega is the weak link, only one person had called Elias a liability. Only one person had consistently tried to push him out. Dante's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a rival. It was a brother. He turned to Luca. Finish it here. Burn the cash. Leave the bodies as a message. Where are you going, boss? Luca grunted. To the hospital, Dante said, checking his watch. Because if the rat knows the hit failed, he's going to try to finish the job himself. Back at the clinic, Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. The pain was a dull throb, masked by heavy morphine. Every time he opened his eyes, he expected to see the ceiling of his cramped apartment. Instead, he saw white tiles and expensive equipment. He tried to move, but a groan escaped his lips. Easy. A voice rumbled. Elias turned his head. Dante was there. But he looked different. The suit jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms covered in tattoos Elias had never seen before. He looked exhausted, covered in soot and grime, but his eyes were glued to Elias's face. The kids, Elias rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. They're home. Guards are at every door. They made you a card, it's mostly glitter, Dante said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He reached out and brushed a stray hair from Elias's forehead. His touch was incredibly gentle for a man who had just dismantled a crime syndicate. You stayed? Elias asked. I had some errands, Dante said darkly. But I came back. I will always come back. He took Elias's hand. Why did you do it, Elias? You signed a contract for money, not for bullets. They're just kids, Dante, Elias whispered, his eyes fluttering. And they're your kids. Dante fell silent. In his world, loyalty was bought. Love was a transaction. But this Omega, he had offered his life for free. I need you to listen to me, Dante said, his voice urgent. I have to leave the room for 10 minutes. I have to set a trap. You are going to be safe, I promise. But someone is coming in here. Someone we know. Who, Adrian? Elias's eyes widened. Adrian. Just pretend to be asleep, Dante said, squeezing his hand. Trust me. He kissed Elias's forehead, lingering for a second too long, and then slipped into the attached bathroom, leaving the door cracked open just an inch. The silence in the private recovery suite was heavy enough to crush a man's lungs. Dante sat in a leather armchair in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. The only light came from the rhythmic green pulse of the heart monitor and the pale orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. He hadn't moved for 4 hours. He hadn't changed his clothes. The white dress shirt he had worn to the recital was stiff with dried blood. Elias's blood. He refused to wash it off. He needed the smell, that sharp metallic scent of copper and terror, to keep his rage focused. He looked at the Omega in the bed. Elias looked impossibly small amongst the tangle of wires and tubes. A soft knock came at the door. Luca stepped in, closing the door softly behind him. It's done, Luca whispered, his voice grave. The Volkovs are gutted. We hit the shipping yard, the warehouse in Gary, and the safe house on Wacker Drive. There's no one left to give orders. Dante didn't look away from Elias. And the leak? Luca hesitated. He shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking under his bulk. We found a burner phone on Yuri's body. The last call was to a number we recognized, boss. Dante finally turned his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, burning with a cold blue fire. Say it. It was Adrian. Dante closed his eyes. He didn't scream. He didn't flip the table. He felt a sickening sense of inevitability. Adrian wasn't just his underboss. He was his cousin. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, fought in the same schoolyards, and risen through the ranks together. Adrian had been the one to drive Dante to the hospital when his wife died. Adrian was the godfather to Toby. He thinks I'm still at the warehouse, Dante said, his voice a low rumble. He thinks Elias is the loose end. He told me earlier that Elias was a liability. He said if Elias died, I'd get my focus back. He's on his way here, Luca said. He called the front desk, checked if visitors were allowed. He's coming to finish it. Dante stood up. The movement was stiff, his joints locking from hours of stillness. He walked over to the bedside table and picked up his heavy custom-made 1911 pistol. He checked the chamber. A round was loaded. He clicked the safety on and placed it on the table, right next to a vase of wilting lilies. Clear the floor, Dante ordered. Remove the guards from the door. Turn off the security cameras in this hallway. I want this place to look abandoned. Boss, Luca warned. If he comes in armed, he won't come in shooting, Dante corrected. Adrian is a coward. He likes things clean. He'll want to make it look like a medical complication. A failed heart. A clot. Dante looked down at Elias, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead with a trembling finger. Go wait in the stairwell. Do not come in until I call you. Luca nodded once and vanished. Dante looked at the bathroom door. It was a small ensuite, dark and cramped. He stepped inside, leaving the door cracked open just an inch, enough to see the bed, enough to see the four drip, enough to see the devil when he walked in. Then he waited. 20 minutes later, the elevator dinged down the hall. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the ward, it sounded like a gunshot. Footsteps followed, soft, purposeful strides on the linoleum floor. They weren't the heavy boots of a soldier. They were the expensive Italian loafers of a man who thought he owned the world. The door handle to room 402 turned slowly. Dante held his breath in the darkness of the bathroom. Through the crack, he watched the sliver of light from the hallway widen as the door opened. Adrian stepped inside. He looked immaculate. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, his hair perfectly coiffed. He held a bouquet of flowers in one hand, a grotesque prop for the murder he was about to commit. He closed the door gently, engaging the lock with a soft click. Adrian stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, just watching Elias. Then he tossed the flowers onto the visitor chair with a careless flick of his wrist. You really are a pretty thing, Adrian whispered to the unconscious Omega. His voice was smooth, lacking any tremor of guilt. It's a shame, really. I liked you. But you just had to play hero. He walked to the side of the bed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small glass vial and a syringe. He held it up to the light, tapping the side to remove air bubbles. Potassium chloride, Adrian murmured, as if explaining a recipe. Stops the heart instantly. No pain. They'll call it cardiac arrest from the trauma. Dante will cry. We'll bury you. And then we get back to business. Adrian sighed, a sound of genuine frustration. You see, Elias, you broke him. He's weak when you're around. He's talking about recitals and dinners. Men like us, we don't get dinners. We get power. And I can't let him throw away the empire for a babysitter. He reached for the 4-port on Elias's arm. He didn't throw it away. A voice said from the darkness. He grew up. Adrian froze. The syringe hovered inches from the plastic tube. Dante kicked the bathroom door open. It slammed against the wall with a deafening bang. Adrian spun around, dropping the syringe. It clattered to the floor, rolling under the bed. His face went pale, his eyes darting to the door, then to Dante. Dom, Adrian stammered, his hands flying up in a surrender gesture. Dom, Jesus, you scared me. I was bringing flowers. Cut the act, Dante said. He didn't yell. He walked forward slowly, step by step, forcing Adrian to back up until he hit the window ledge. I heard you, Adrian. I heard every word. Adrian's mask crumbled. The panic in his eyes was replaced by a desperate, cornered malice. You weren't supposed to be here. You were supposed to be killing Russians. I did, Dante said calmly. I killed them all. Yuri told me about the text message before he died. He told me about the inside man who wanted the throne. I did it for us. Adrian shouted, his voice cracking. For the family. You've gone soft, Dante. Look at you, you're sitting in a hospital crying over the help while the Volkovs are encroaching on our territory. I made a deal to save the Calvetti name. You ordered a hit on a car containing my children. Dante roared. The sudden volume made Adrian flinch. You didn't care if Toby or Bella took a bullet, did you? As long as Elias died. Collateral damage. Adrian spat. The kids weren't the target. But if they got hurt, well, tragedy builds character, doesn't it? It would have made you ruthless again. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dante stared at his cousin, seeing him truly for the first time. He didn't see a partner. He saw a disease. Ruthless, Dante repeated softly. He lunged. It wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling. Dante grabbed Adrian by the lapels of his expensive suit and slammed him into the wall so hard the plaster cracked. Adrian tried to gouge Dante's eyes, but Dante caught his wrist and twisted it. A sickening snap echoed through the room. Adrian screamed, his knees buckling. But Dante held him up. You want ruthless? Dante hissed, his face inches from Adrian's. Ruthless is what I'm going to do to you. He threw Adrian across the room. Adrian crashed into the medical cart, sending trays and instruments clattering everywhere. He scrambled on the floor, trying to reach for the gun Dante had left on the table. The bait. Adrian grabbed the 1911, spinning around on his knees, aiming at Dante. Die! Just die! He pulled the trigger. Click. Adrian pulled it again. Click. Click. He looked at the gun in horror. I took the firing pin out, Dante said, standing over him like a monolith of judgment. You really think I'd leave a loaded weapon within your reach? I'm not sloppy, Adrian. You are. Dante kicked the gun out of Adrian's hand. He grabbed Adrian by the throat, lifting him off the ground, squeezing until Adrian's face turned purple, his feet kicking uselessly at the air. Please, Adrian choked out. Family. Elias's family, Dante whispered. You are nothing. He threw Adrian to the floor. The door opened, and Lucas stepped in, flanked by 2 other guards. They looked at the broken man on the floor with zero sympathy. "Get him out of here," Dante ordered, turning his back on his cousin. "Take him to the basement of the warehouse. I'll deal with him when he wakes up." "Dom! Dante!" Adrian screamed as he was dragged out. "You can't do this. I'm your blood." The door slammed shut, cutting off his screams. Dante stood there, chest heaving, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He walked back to the sink in the corner and washed his hands again, scrubbing until his skin was raw. When he turned back, he saw a pair of eyes watching him. Elias was awake. "How much did you hear?" Dante asked, his voice hoarse. Elias blinked slowly. He looked groggy, pain etched into the corners of his eyes, but his gaze was lucid. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. Dante quickly poured a cup of water and held the straw to his lips. Elias drank greedily. "Enough," he whispered finally. "He wanted to inject me. He wanted to take you away from me," Dante said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "He failed." Elias looked at Dante's hands. They were clean now, but he knew what they were capable of. He had seen the violence in his eyes just moments ago. It should have terrified him. He was a nanny from the suburbs. He built Lego castles and made peanut butter sandwiches. He shouldn't be in a room with a man who had just sentenced his cousin to death. But then he looked at Dante's face. He saw the exhaustion. He saw the terror, not of Adrian, but of losing him. "The children?" Elias asked. "Safe," Dante promised. "They are at the estate. Mrs. Higgins is guarding them with a shotgun." "I'm not joking." A weak smile tugged at Elias's lips. "She always did scare me." The room fell silent again. Dante picked up Elias's hand, tracing the veins on the back of his wrist. "I have to ask you something," Dante said, his voice low. "And I need you to answer honestly. No contracts. No employee obligations." Elias squeezed his hand weakly. "Okay. Why did you do it?" Dante looked into Elias's eyes, searching for the truth. "You could have stayed down. You could have covered your head. Why did you cover them?" "I don't know," Elias admitted softly. "I didn't think. I saw the gun, and I knew I couldn't let them get hurt. I love them, Dante. I know I'm just the nanny, but I love them." "You're not just the nanny," Dante said fiercely. "Not anymore." He leaned in closer. His scent, smoke and cedar, was stronger now, wrapping around Elias like a blanket. Elias felt his omega instinct stir, felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the morphine. "I'm going to give you a choice, Elias. When you heal, you can leave. I will give you $5 million. I will set you up in Italy, France, wherever you want. You will never have to work again. You will be safe. Far away from me. And far away from this life." Elias watched him. "And the other option?" "You stay," Dante said, the words seeming hard for him to get out. "You stay here with me. With the kids. But if you stay, you need to know what you're signing up for. This life, it's war. There will be other Adrians. There will be other threats. I will protect you with my last breath, but I cannot promise peace." Elias looked at the ceiling, then back at Dante. He thought about his lonely apartment. He thought about the debt collectors. Then he thought about Toby's laugh. He thought about Bella's hugs. And he thought about this man, this dangerous, broken, beautiful alpha, who looked at him as if he were the only light in a dark universe. 5 million is a lot of money, Elias mused. Dante's face fell slightly. He began to pull his hand away. I understand. I'll have the lawyers draft the. Elias tightened his grip on Dante's hand. I'm not finished. He looked Dante dead in the eye. I don't want the money. I want the risk. Dante froze. Elias. I can't go back to a normal life, Dante, Elias whispered. Not after this. And I can't imagine waking up in a world where I don't see those kids every day. Or you. He reached up with his good arm and touched Dante's cheek. His stubble was rough against Elias's palm. I'm staying. But we are renegotiating the contract. Dante let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He turned his face into Elias's palm and kissed it. Name your terms. No more secrets, Elias said. If there's a threat, you tell me. If you're bleeding, you show me. We do this together. Or not at all. Dante nodded, his forehead resting against Elias's. Together. I swear it. He pulled back, looking at Elias with an intensity that made the Omega's breath catch. There's something else, Dante said. Something I need to do. Something I've wanted to do since I saw you lying in that parking lot. What? Dante leaned in slowly, giving Elias every chance to pull away. Their lips met, soft at first, then deeper, more desperate. Elias's scent bloomed, honey and chamomile flooding the room, and Dante groaned against his mouth. Mine, Dante growled, the alpha in him surfacing. You're mine, Elias. I'm not letting you go. Elias's Omega instincts purred in satisfaction. He felt safe, safer than he'd ever felt in his life. Wrapped in Dante's arms, surrounded by his scent, he knew he had made the right choice. Yours, he whispered back. Always. 6 months later, the Calvetti estate had changed. The 12-foot iron fences were still there, and the guards still patrolled the perimeter, but the atmosphere inside the walls was transformed. The garden, once manicured and sterile, was now dotted with colorful toys. A swing set had been installed near the fountain. It was a crisp autumn day. The trees were blazing with gold and crimson leaves. In the master bedroom, Elias stood before a full-length mirror. The tuxedo was a masterpiece of fabric and cut, fitted to perfection. A scar on his shoulder was hidden beneath the delicate fabric, a secret badge of honor he carried with pride. You look like a prince. Bella squealed from the bed, where she was jumping up and down in her flower girl dress. No, Toby corrected, adjusting his bow tie in the mirror with serious concentration. He looks like a king. Daddy said so. Elias smiled at them through the reflection. You two better not wrinkle those outfits before the photos. We won't, they chorused. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Higgins poked her head in, her usual stern expression softened by a genuine smile. It's time, dear. The guests are seated. Is he nervous? Elias asked. Mrs. Higgins chuckled. He's been pacing the altar for 20 minutes. I think he's terrified you're going to climb out the window. Elias turned, picking up his bouquet of white roses. He should know by now. I don't run. The ceremony was held in the back garden, overlooking the lake. It wasn't a massive affair with politicians and judges. It was intimate. The men standing guard were the ones who had bled with Dante. The guests were the few people in Chicago who could be trusted. As Elias stepped onto the aisle, the string quartet began to play. The crowd stood. Dante was waiting under an arch of white orchids. When he saw Elias, his composure broke. This man who had stared down barrels of guns and ordered the deaths of enemies without blinking, he had tears in his eyes. He looked different than the man Elias had met in the interview. The darkness was still there, it would always be part of him, but it was no longer consuming him. It was a shield now. Not a cage. Elias reached the altar. Dante took his hands. His grip was warm and solid. "You came," he whispered, as if he still couldn't believe it. "I told you," Elias smiled, his thumb brushing Dante's knuckles. "I had to make sure you were following the new contract terms." The priest began the service, speaking of love, sacrifice, and loyalty. But neither Dante nor Elias needed the sermon. They had already lived the vows. They had sworn them in a parking lot under fire, in a hospital room covered in blood, and in the quiet moments of healing that followed. "Do you, Dante, take this Omega to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" Dante looked at Elias. He thought of the bullet Elias took. He thought of the night in the hospital. He thought of Adrian and the Volkovs and the peace he had finally secured for his family. "I do," Dante said. "And I will. Every day." "And do you, Elias, take this Alpha to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elias looked at the twins, who were watching with wide, happy eyes from the front row. He looked at Dante, his partner, his protector, his love. "I do," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Then by the power vested in me," the priest smiled, "I pronounce you husbands. You may kiss." Dante didn't hesitate. He pulled Elias close, dipping him slightly, and kissed him with a passion that made the guards whistle and Mrs. Higgins blush. As they broke the kiss, breathless and laughing, Dante rested his forehead against Elias's. "I love you, Mr. Calvetti," he murmured. "I love you too, boss," Elias whispered back. They turned to face the crowd, hands clasped tight, as they walked back down the aisle, petals raining down on them. Elias knew that the story wasn't over. There would be challenges. There would be enemies. But as he looked at the Alpha beside him and the children running ahead of them, he knew one thing for certain. They were untouchable. From a terrified Omega Nanny to the king of the Chicago underworld's consort, Elias didn't just survive the Calvetti family. He saved it. He proved that sometimes the strongest armor isn't a bulletproof vest, but the courage to love what others fear. Dante thought he hired an employee. But he found the one person willing to bleed for his heart. Extra story. The warehouse on the south side smelled like rust, blood, and regret. Dante Calvetti had been standing in the same spot for 3 hours, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the steel door that led to the basement. The concrete floor was cold beneath his feet, but he barely felt it. He hadn't slept in 48 hours. He hadn't eaten. His alpha instincts were screaming at him to go home, to check on the Omega lying in that hospital bed, to make sure Elias was still breathing. But first, this. Adrian had been down there for 12 hours now. Luca and his men had taken turns interviewing him, the kind of interview that left bruises and broken bones and shattered pride. Dante had told them to keep him alive. That was the only instruction. Everything else was up to them. The door creaked open. Luca stepped out, wiping blood from his knuckles with a dirty rag. His face was impassive, but Dante could smell the satisfaction radiating off him, the scent of a beta who had done his job well. "Boss," Luca said, his voice as flat as ever. "He's ready to talk. He's been ready for the last hour. I just wanted to make sure he meant it." Dante nodded. "Anything useful?" "Volkovs are dead. You already handled that." But Adrian had a backup plan, a contingency in case the hit on the Omega failed. He had a man on the inside at the clinic. A nurse. She was supposed to finish the job if the potassium chloride didn't work. Dante's eyes flickered with cold fire. Is she dead? She will be by morning, Luca said simply. Adrian gave up the name 2 hours ago. My men are handling it. Good. Dante walked past Luca and descended the stairs into the basement. The air grew colder with each step. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently, casting long shadows across the concrete walls. The smell of copper was stronger here, fresher. And beneath it, the sharp, acrid scent of fear. Adrian was chained to a chair in the center of the room. His expensive suit was torn and stained. His face was a ruin of purple bruises and dried blood. One eye was swollen shut. His left arm hung at an awkward angle, the one Dante had snapped. When Adrian saw Dante, something flickered in his remaining eye. Fear. Resentment. Something that might have been regret. But it was quickly replaced by a desperate, pathetic hope. Dom, Adrian croaked, his voice raw and broken. Dom, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was jealous. I made a mistake. Dante didn't respond. He walked to the table where Luca had laid out his tools, pliers, wire cutters, a blowtorch, a knife. He picked up the knife, turning it over in his hands, watching the light glint off the blade. I was just so angry, Adrian continued, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. After your wife died, you shut down. You weren't yourself. You weren't the man who built this empire. And I thought if I could just get you to focus again, to be ruthless again, we could take back everything we'd lost. Dante finally looked at him. You thought ordering a hit on my children would make me focus. Not the children. Adrian shouted, desperation clawing at his voice. I told them to avoid the children. The Omega, he was the target. He was making you soft. He was distracting you from the business. I was trying to save you, Dom. Dante walked over to him slowly. His footsteps echoed in the silence. He crouched down so his face was level with Adrian's, so close that Adrian could smell the smoke and cedar of his scent, the unmistakable presence of a dominant alpha who had already made up his mind. Let me tell you something about Elias, Dante said softly. He's not a distraction. He's the only thing that made me realize what I was losing. For 2 years after my wife died, I was a ghost. I was going through the motions. I was keeping the empire running, but I wasn't living. I wasn't a father to my children. I wasn't a man. I was a machine. He paused, watching Adrian's one good eye widen. And then Elias walked into my life. And he wasn't afraid of me. He wasn't impressed by me. He just saw the kids, saw how broken they were, and he loved them anyway. He loved them without conditions, without contracts, without asking for anything in return. Dante's voice dropped to a whisper. He took a bullet for them. He bled out on the pavement for them. And you were going to inject him with poison in a hospital bed. Adrian sobbed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll leave Chicago. I'll go to another country. I'll disappear. Just let me live, Dom. Please. Dante stood up. He looked down at his cousin, his childhood friend, his partner, his brother in arms, and felt nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness. I used to think family was everything, Dante said. I used to think loyalty meant protecting your blood, no matter what. But you taught me something, Adrian. You taught me that blood means nothing if there's poison in it. And you're poison. He turned and walked toward the stairs. Adrian screamed. Dom! Dom, please. Don't leave me here. Don't leave me with them. Dante paused at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't turn around. Luca, he said. Yes, boss. Make it quick. He walked up the stairs. A single gunshot echoed behind him. The drive back to the estate took 40 minutes. Dante spent the entire time staring out the window, watching the city lights blur past. His hands were steady on the steering wheel, but his mind was elsewhere, floating somewhere between the warehouse basement and the hospital room where Elias was waiting. He pulled into the estate gates at 3 a.m. The guards recognized his car and waved him through. The house was dark except for the soft glow of a lamp in the east wing, Elias's wing. Dante parked in the garage and walked inside, his footsteps silent on the marble floor. He paused outside Elias's door. He could hear the soft, steady rhythm of breathing. The Omega was asleep. Dante's instincts screamed at him to go in, to check on him, to make sure he was still breathing. But he hesitated. He was covered in blood. His clothes smelled like fear and violence. The last thing he wanted was to wake Elias up and scare him. But before he could turn away, the door opened. Elias stood in the doorway, wearing a simple white t-shirt and gray sweatpants. His shoulder was heavily bandaged, the sling supporting his arm. His hair was messy, his eyes still heavy with sleep. But he was awake. And he was staring at Dante with an expression that made the Alpha's breath catch. "You're back," Elias said softly. "I'm back," Dante echoed. Elias's eyes traveled over Dante's ruined shirt, the bloodstains, the exhaustion etched into his face. His Omega scent, honey and chamomile, spiked with concern. He reached out with his good hand and touched Dante's chest, his fingers resting over the Alpha's heart. "You're hurt." "Not mine," Dante said quickly. "I'm fine. The blood, it's not mine." Elias didn't look convinced. He stepped back, pulling Dante into the room with his good hand. The door clicked shut behind them. "Sit," Elias said, pointing to the edge of the bed. "Take your shirt off." "Elias, I'm fine." "Sit. Now." There was something in Elias's voice, a quiet authority that Dante had never heard before. It made the Alpha pause. It made him obey. Dante sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled his ruined shirt over his head and tossed it onto the floor. Elias's eyes traveled over his chest, cataloging the bruises, the cuts, the scrapes. His scent sharpened with worry. "Adrian?" Elias asked. "Dealt with," Dante said flatly. "He won't hurt anyone ever again." Elias nodded. He didn't ask for details. He didn't flinch. He just walked to the bathroom, came back with a warm, damp cloth, and began cleaning the blood off Dante's skin. His touch was gentle, impossibly gentle for someone who had been shot 3 weeks ago. "You're still healing," Dante said, his voice rough. "You shouldn't be doing this." "I'm not the one who was torturing his cousin in a warehouse," Elias said dryly. "Shut up and let me take care of you." Dante fell silent. He let Elias work, let the Omega's hands move across his chest, his shoulders, his arms. The warmth of the cloth was soothing. The scent of honey and chamomile wrapped around him like a blanket, pushing back the darkness that had been clawing at his mind for days. "I wasn't going to come in here," Dante said suddenly. "I was going to go to my room. I didn't want to wake you." Elias paused, his hand hovering over Dante's chest. "Why?" "Because I didn't want you to see me like this. After what I did tonight, I didn't want you to be afraid of me." Elias looked up at him. His eyes were soft in the dim light, his expression unreadable. "I'm not afraid of you, Dante. I never was. I was afraid of the world you live in. I was afraid of the bullets and the blood and the constant threat of death. But I was never afraid of you. He set the cloth aside and sat down beside Dante on the bed. His good hand found Dante's, their fingers intertwining. Do you want to know something? Elias said quietly. The first time I saw you, in the hallway, bleeding from that gunshot wound, I should have been terrified. You were covered in blood. You had guns pointed at me. You threatened to erase me. And all I could think was that you were the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. Dante stared at him. What? It was the way you looked at your children, Elias continued. Even when you were bleeding out, even when you were in pain, the first thing you did was make sure they were okay. You asked about them before you asked about yourself. That's not the behavior of a monster. That's the behavior of a father. Dante's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. I know who you are, Dante Calvetti, Elias said softly. I know what you've done. I know what you're capable of. And I know that you will always, always protect your family. That's why I stayed. That's why I'm still here. Because I know that the man who kissed my forehead in that hospital room is the same man who's sitting beside me right now. Not the Don. Not the King of Chicago. Just you. Dante's hands were shaking. He didn't realize it until Elias reached up and cupped his cheek, steadying him. Come here, Elias whispered. He pulled Dante down onto the bed. Dante went willingly, his body curling around Elias's, his head resting against the Omega's chest. Elias's heartbeat was steady beneath his ear, slow and reassuring. The Omega's good arm wrapped around him, fingers threading through his hair. You're going to be okay, Elias murmured. We're going to be okay. The kids are safe. Adrian is gone. And I'm right here. Dante breathed in his scent, honey, chamomile, warmth, home. His alpha instincts finally quieted. The rage that had been burning in his chest for days slowly dimmed, replaced by something softer. Something he'd thought he'd lost forever. Peace. I'm sorry, Dante whispered. I'm sorry you got pulled into this. I'm sorry you got shot. I'm sorry I wasn't fast enough to stop it. Stop, Elias said firmly. You saved my life. You carried me out of that parking lot. You stayed with me in the hospital. You held my hand when I woke up. You did everything right. I should have seen Adrian coming. I should have known. Nobody sees betrayal coming. That's what makes it betrayal. Dante fell silent. He let himself be held, let himself be comforted. It was strange, he had been the strong one for so long, the protector, the alpha who never showed weakness. But with Elias, he didn't have to pretend. With Elias, he could just be. You know what the kids asked me today? Elias said suddenly. Dante looked up. What? Bella asked if you were coming home. She was scared. She thought you were going to stay at the warehouse forever, like you did after their mother died. Dante's heart clenched. I would never. I know, Elias said gently. I told her you were coming back. I told her you would always come back. Because that's who you are. That's who you've always been. You just forgot for a while. Dante pressed his face against Elias's chest, inhaling deeply. The scent of honey and chamomile was stronger now, the Omega's natural sweetness cutting through the leftover darkness. Elias's hand moved through his hair, slow and soothing. I don't deserve you, Dante murmured. That's not for you to decide. Dante laughed, a short, startled sound. It was the first time he'd laughed in weeks. Elias smiled down at him, his eyes bright in the dim light. Did you just laugh? Elias asked, pretending to be shocked. Dante Calvetti laughed. I should mark this on the calendar. Shut up, Dante said, but there was no heat in it. Make me. Dante sat up, moving before he could think. His hands cupped Elias's face, tilting his head back. Their lips met in a kiss that was softer than the first one, slower. Less desperate. More certain. When they broke apart, Elias was smiling. I love you, Elias said. I don't care if it's too fast. I don't care if it's dangerous. I love you, Dante Calvetti. Dante looked at him, this Omega who had walked into his life with nothing but a degree in early childhood education and a heart full of hope. This Omega who had taken a bullet for his children, who had held his hand in the hospital, who had refused to run when any sensible person would have fled. I love you too, Dante said, the words rough and raw. I thought I couldn't love again. I thought my heart died with my wife. But you made it beat again. You saved me, Elias. You saved my family. You saved everything. Elias's eyes were shining with unshed tears. He pulled Dante down again, wrapping his good arm around him, holding him close. Then let's save each other, Elias whispered. Every single day. 6 weeks later, Dante walked into the garden and found Elias sitting on the grass with the twins. Toby was showing Elias how to build a Lego spaceship. Bella was braiding flowers into a crown, which she promptly placed on Elias's head. They were laughing at something Toby had said, the sound bright and unrestrained. Dante leaned against the archway and watched them. His family. His pack. Elias looked up, catching his eye. His face lit up with that smile, the one that made Dante's heart do strange, un-alpha-like things. He walked over, dropping down onto the grass beside them. Daddy! Bella squealed, climbing onto his lap. Look! I made Elias a crown. He's the Flower King. I see that, Dante said, his voice warm. The Flower King looks very handsome. Elias blushed. I look ridiculous. Ridiculously beautiful, Dante corrected. Toby made a gagging noise. Gross, Daddy. Don't be gross. Elias laughed, that beautiful, pure laugh that made everything feel right in the world. He leaned over and kissed Dante's cheek, quick and easy, like it was the most natural thing in the world. You look tired, Elias said softly. I didn't sleep well, Dante admitted. Nightmares. The smile faded from Elias's face. He reached over and took Dante's hand, his thumb tracing soothing circles across the alpha's knuckles. The twins, distracted by the Lego spaceship, didn't notice the shift in the air. We'll talk tonight, Elias promised. After the kids are asleep. Dante nodded, grateful. He let himself lean into Elias's warmth, let himself feel the comfort of being near his mate. The Omega scent was stronger now, no more suppressant patches, no more hiding. Elias was his, fully and completely, and every instinct in Dante's alpha brain sang with satisfaction. What would I do without you? Dante murmured, quiet enough that the twins couldn't hear. Elias smiled. Probably be very miserable and very alone. Probably, Dante agreed. That's why I'm never letting you go. Good, Elias said, squeezing his hand. Because I have no intention of going anywhere. Bella looked up from her flower crown, her eyes wide and serious. Daddy? Is Elias staying with us forever? Dante looked at Elias. Elias looked at him, his eyes soft and full of love. Yes, Dante said, his voice steady and sure. Elias is staying with us forever. Bella cheered. Toby pumped his fist in the air. And Elias leaned his head against Dante's shoulder, his scent warm and content, and let himself be held. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. And that was everything. The end.